Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me. It's also my first visit to Panama, so Panama has a lot of new friends. Well, in the words of one of our Britain's greatest ever comedies, now for something completely different, because I can promise you that I'm not going to mention a single gene or a single enzyme. So I'm going to talk to you about innovations in publishing, which have largely taken place in the last 15 or 20 years or so, and try and give some sense of where they're going to lead, although I don't necessarily have answers to that question. So, outline of my talk, first of all, I'll start with a little bit of history of academic publishing. I'll talk about the internet revolution and what that's brought about, with a bit of time devoted to open access. I'll talk about innovation in metrics, and I'll talk about innovation in process. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of history. The innovations of scholarly publishing. Well, as I'm sure you're all aware, movable type was invented about 600 years ago, but it took a little bit of time for the scientific community to mature and catch up. And so the first journal to appear, which actually published what we would now recognize as original research, was the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which is still going strong, and that was first published during the reign of in London during the reign of Charles II in 1665. And it took a little while for the medical community to become scientists for a start. So the first medical journal didn't appear for another couple of hundred years or so, and the Lancet wasn't the first, but the Lancet is one of the ones that's been in publication now for we're now in our 192nd year, so we'll be celebrating our 200th year in 1823. This is the man who founded the Lancet. He's a guy called Thomas Wackley. He was a surgeon. He was later also an MP and a coroner in London. And the Lancet has been going continuously without missing a single week of publication since 1823. Here you can see that on the left-hand side, you can see the cover of the very first issue of the journal, and in the last few months, we've celebrated the 10,000th issue of the Lancet. Now, of course, the Lancet has matured considerably, particularly in the last 20 years or so. We have gone from being just a weekly general medical journal to now we publish a whole suite of specialty medical journals. So we have monthly journals in oncology, in neurology, infectious diseases, of which I'm the editor, respiratory medicine, diabetes and endocrinology, in psychiatry, and then in the last year or so we've also added hematology and HIV. Both those journals are online-only journals. There is no print version. And then an addition about 3 years ago was the Lancet Global Health, which is both a online-only journal and it's our first entirely open access journal. And I will come back to open access later on. Now, we do still print. We print thousands of copies of all these journals. We don't actually sell many of them. We give most of them away. But of course, we do think in terms of issues as well. We very much think in terms of issues. But the principal route of publication these days is our journals' websites. So this is the homepage of the Lancet Infectious Diseases. And publishing online allows us to do many things which are not constrained by the concept of an issue. So, for example, in the last couple of years, we've had an Ebola resource centre, which has brought together in a single website all the material which we've published on Ebola, and that has been freely available for anybody with access to the internet. And then very recently, in the last month or so, we've started a Zika virus resource centre. So there's a lot more to this. The Lancet is just one example, but there's a lot more to academic publication these days than just publishing articles. bound within a single cover. So, for example, The Lancet is involved in, on our website, we have what we call Lancet TV, which is just little film clips and interviews, really. We have things, we are involved in conference organisation, and we have a considerable presence on Twitter and on Facebook. So how is this history, where is it leading to now? So let's just have a look at the historical view of scholarly publishing. And on this slide here, you can see the total number of active academic scholarly refereed peer-reviewed journals going back to the beginning of the last century. So around 1900, there were fewer than 750, estimated to be fewer than 750 scholarly academic journals. That number has now risen to closer to 30,000. And as you can see by the inset slide, this part here, then there's been an increase of approximately 10,000 just since the turn of the millennium. And the number of journals is growing by 2, 3, 4% per annum. And that's also reflected in the number of articles which are being published. This was some research which came out a couple of years ago, which looked at the growth in the annual number of cited references going all the way back to 1650 up to the present day. And it counts citations, which accounts for the apparent drop-off just here. That isn't real, that's just because the citations haven't yet caught up with the articles that have been published. But the message of this slide is that there's been a doubling, or there continues to be a doubling, in the global scientific output about every 9 years or so. So what does academic publishing, on particularly scientific, technical and medical publishing, look like these days? Well, there are around 2,000 STM publishers. They are responsible for around about 20,000 peer-reviewed journals and produce around 1.4 million peer-reviewed articles every year. Okay, so building on that, what's the ongoing role of scientific publication? I don't really think that this is changed very much, except in the means by which it happens, since scientific publishing started going back into the 17th century. So scientific publishing is responsible for registration, so that's giving, if you like, a kind of an official note that research has been submitted and it's been published. Certification, by which I mean things like peer review to ensure validity and integrity of research submissions. Dissemination, so that provides a medium for discovery and for findings to be shared. And preservation, so that's preserving the minutes and the records of science for posterity. Now, the technical means by which this happens has changed greatly. So somebody wrote an article recently about what publishers do these days, and they reckon that publishers do 96 different things, which probably explains why I'm permanently in need of a holiday. Dissemination. Let's come to dissemination. The internet has completely changed the way that knowledge is disseminated. We now publish primarily in terms of single article downloads, and we publish via our own website, thelancet.com, but most of our downloads come via Elsevier's journal database, which is called Science Direct. So it's a database of journal articles and book chapters from around about 3,500 journals and more than 34,000 books. And on this graph, I've shown the growth in the number of article downloads from both the Lancet and the Lancet Infectious Diseases going back for about 5 years. So as you can see, the Lancet's grown from about 725,000 or so article downloads per year, and it's now up to almost 11 million up here. Lancet Infectious Diseases taking some time to catch up, 600,000. Now we're going up to approaching 1 million per year. Where are these downloads coming from? You can see on this map here that the darker pins indicate where most of the downloads are taking place. So downloads are still predominantly coming from the traditional markets in North America, in Western Europe, in Japan, in Australasia. But as you can see, there's a pin there, quite dark-coloured pin for Brazil. If we actually look by country here, this is the countries which downloaded Lancet articles in 2015. Then the United States, United Kingdom are still up at the top, but Brazil is in there. So there is a presence from emerging markets. When I first joined the Lancet 25 years ago, then we had almost no sales whatsoever in Korea, and Korea is now appearing on this chart. And a similar picture for the Lancet infectious diseases, although interestingly here there is one African country which makes an appearance here, and again this is a first. To see this sort of thing emerging, and is probably only possible because of the dissemination opportunities of the internet. I've actually looked at South America, Latin America in particular, and to see where ScienceDirect downloads are coming from here. This is all Lancet journals in 2015. As you can see, then Brazil predominates, but our journals are being downloaded in most countries in Latin America. Although I can see that Bolivia and Paraguay don't have any downloads at all, and I can't explain that. In terms of individual countries, then Brazil predominates for both the Lancet infectious diseases and for Brazil and for the Lancet. I think Panama is in there. Yeah, Panama is, where are we? There's Panama for the Lancet infectious diseases. This is the institutions which have been downloading Lancet and Lancet infectious diseases in 2015, divided up by the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, with Brazilian institutions again predominating, but a Mexican institution showing a considerable presence as well. And then, for your interest, I got some numbers on what institutions in Panama are downloading articles from the Lancet and the Lancet infectious diseases. The numbers aren't very high. I can't interpret this, I'm afraid, because I don't know these institutions, but if anybody wants a copy of this, then I'm quite happy to pass that on. Okay, let's change gear and look at a revolution in publishing which has been brought about by the internet age, and that is open access journals. The philosophy of open access is that research findings should be freely available to the people who've paid to have the research done. And this has always been a noble desire, but in the age of paper publication, pretty much impossible. The internet, of course, eases the route to dissemination for free. The way it works in practice is that papers are free to read, they're free to download, they're free to copy, distribute, print, search, or link to full text. That's the perfect view of how open access should work. Authors pay a fee, or the authors' institutions more likely, pay a fee to have their papers published in journals which provide open access publication. That fee can range from the hundreds into the thousands of dollars. Here are just some examples of open access publishers. Biomed Central was probably the first. PLOS is, I think, predominates in the market. There's some fairly new, reputable ones which have come along recently. eLife, for example, you don't pay a publication fee for eLife. It is funded by grants from the Wellcome Trust, from the Howard Hughes, and from a German institution whose name has temporarily escaped my mind. PeerJ is an interesting experiment in which a researcher can pay a lifetime fee, a one-off lifetime fee for publication. PLOS One is an offshoot of the Public Library of Science, of PLOS, which came along a few years later. And I don't come from a primarily open access journal, so I don't want to sound critical here, but the reason PLOS One exists is because if it didn't, then PLOS Medicine wouldn't exist. Because once PLOS stopped receiving grant money from funders such as Bill Gates, then their financial model completely fell to pieces, and they had to publish PLOS One so they had sufficient volume of publication in order to publish high-quality journals such as PLOS Medicine. Now, the model of open access journals is that the author retains copyright. The author gives a license to distribute, to reproduce, and to commercially exploit. It is mandated by some funders, by an increasing number of funders. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, the Wellcome Trust and the various research councils mandate open access publication. An unfortunate development are what's called predatory open access journals. There's been an absolute explosion in new journals which offer a very poor service. They offer a very low standard of peer review. They offer no guarantee of continuity. They're quite happy to take your money, but I'm afraid that they don't offer the sort of standard of service and the longevity that the traditional publishers offer. Just some open access terminology so you understand what I'm talking about. Green open access is a term used when open access is provided immediately before provided before or immediately after publication by the author self-archiving. So by and large, if your paper goes down the green route, then you don't pay the publisher, but you are allowed to archive the paper on your own personal or institutional website or on any website you choose, and that is to allow people to archive in PubMed Central. Or in similar national repositories. Gold open access I've mentioned already. That's immediate open access provided by a publisher, usually with a publication fee paid. Delayed open access, that's open access after an embargo period has expired. So that's 6 months. Normally 6 months or a year, and then the complete contra to open access, which is paid access, where it's the end user that pays either through a subscription model or for individual paper downloads. There are, if you can go to this website, the Directory of Open Access Journals, there are, when was this number? I downloaded this number on Friday. So as of Friday, there are 11,276 open access journals in 136 countries, and they had archived almost 2,200,000 articles. So this number changes every day. As I've said, with open access, it's the authors who retain the copyright, and there are various forms of copyright license which you can sign up to. The most popular ones are what's called Creative Commons licenses, and they permit various levels of reuse of your information. So, for example, the so-called CC BY license, that's this one here, pretty much allows somebody else to do anything with your paper. So you can anybody can copy and distribute the article, they can create extracts, they can translate it, they can create abstracts, they can alter and revise the text if they want to, they can make commercial use provided the author is attributed. And the text can be data mined. And then at the other end is the sort of more restrictive end, which allows copy and distribution, but you can't change or alter the article in a way, and you're not allowed to data mine it. And then in between is CC BY NCSA is pretty much this, but no commercial exploitation. And these are numbers from 2014, so they're slightly out of date now. But as you can see, the uptake of Creative Commons licenses is growing quite explosively, and was approaching 900 million by the end of 2014. What's the overall uptake of open access? So these are the latest numbers I can obtain. They are up to the end of 2013. So that the bottom line message here is that the share of open access is growing, papers is growing at approximately 20% a year, but then the so-called subscription model is also still growing at 2 or 3% a year. So open access has a very firm, has more than a foothold in the market, but I'm not quite sure where this is all going to play out. And open access has brought about an enormous number of controversies between people who say everything should be open access, we shouldn't have to pay to read any science, and those who say the world just doesn't work in that sort of way. So for example, here's just an example of a current controversy between what's labelled here as a pirate website. This is a kind of academic article equivalent of Napster, in that they are storing and redistributing academic articles without any sort of copyright permission, which librarians kind of like, but also they hate it because if the publishers find out that the articles came originally from through their library's license, then the libraries can themselves be in trouble. So there's a huge amount of controversy about where open access will go, and in actual fact, academic articles are much more freely available on the internet than the perception that you might gather from some of the open access advocates. So these are data up to the end of 2012, which estimated that 50% of all scientific papers can be downloaded free on the internet through either via open access or via people self-archiving. And in the end, I think what is absolutely crucial to remember is that open access might be free to the end user, but it is not free. Somebody is paying, somebody is doing the work, and somebody is paying. Even if it's an author self-archiving, then somebody is paying to host and maintain that website, and to maintain the security and integrity of that website. Okay, so let's move on to another development going back to the 1960s now, but it's moved on considerably in recent years, which is metrics, which is ways that the impact of publication is measured. So here's a whole range of metrics. I can't even remember what these two mean, but impact factor is the kind of granddaddy, eigenfactor is a development of it, and I'll also take you through the H index. So let's look at impact factor to begin with. So this is the impact factor of all the decent infectious diseases journals. And as you can see, then this is the Lancet Infectious Diseases. And not wishing to blow my own trumpet, but we are way in advance of any other infectious disease journal. However, what you need to bear in mind here, and this is why impact factor is far from a perfect measure, is that the Lancet Infectious Diseases publishes only something like 120 or so citable items per year. Our next nearest competitor, Clinical Infectious Diseases, publishes 5 or 6 times as many articles per year. So their numerator is considerably bigger than ours. And it's also important to bear in mind when thinking about impact factor that it is a measure, it was designed to be a measure of journal impact. It is not an measure of the impact of an individual paper or of an individual author's work. And I do think it's a crying shame, it's scandalous, the way that academic institutions have used impact factor, journal impact factor, as a proxy for the value of an individual department's or an individual author's work. Eigenfactor is similar to impact factor, except it considers over a 5-year period. It counts over a 5-year period rather than over a 2-year period. It excludes self-citations, and it does include a weighting element as well. So you might argue it's a sort of slightly more refined version of impact factor. I think this is a very interesting development, something called the H index. So this is a index designed to give a measure of the impact of an individual's work rather than of a journal, although it can be applied to journals. So what you do is you order an individual's papers from the most cited down to the least cited, and then you draw a 45-degree line, and where it hits the axis is your H factor. So there are caveats to this, of course. And the biggest of which, of course, is that if somebody is a young career researcher, then they're just not going to have accumulated enough publications in order to have a high H factor, regardless of the quality of the work that they've been involved in. Now, as I've said, you can calculate H-index if you want for journals, and this is where we see the difference from impact factor, is that because we haven't been going nearly as long and haven't published nearly as many papers as clinical infectious diseases, by this measure, then we drop down to fourth from first. Now, a very important recent development is basically counting the impact of social media. And this is something called Altmetrics. And what Altmetrics does is it measures mentions of scientific papers on Twitter, on Facebook, through online news outlets and various other online sources as well. But basically it's a measure of buzz, if you like, on the internet surrounding a single paper. So what I've looked at here is this is a paper, this is the first paper we've ever published from Panama. It's on the randomized trial of a type 2 polio vaccine. It was only published just before Christmas, so it hasn't had time to get a great great Altmetrics score, but it already has an Altmetrics score of 33, and you can see here it tells you what they've done for you is they've counted what that means in terms of papers of all papers published and papers of a similar age. Here is the Lancet Infectious Diseases paper with our highest ever Altmetrics score. This was only published in last November. It has an Altmetrics score of 1,470 already. Of the nearly 5 million papers that Altmetrics have calculated a score of, then this is the 218th. So this is, in terms of buzz on the internet, this is an incredibly impactful paper. That does not necessarily mean that it will have long-term academic impact, although in the case of this particular study it will, but that's not always the case. Okay, let's move on and look at some of the revolutions in process which there have been over the last 20 years ago. And again, these have all been facilitated by the birth and growth of the internet. The Lancet journals, and in fact most reputable medical journals, will not publish a randomized trial these days unless it has been registered in a trial registry at the time of by the time it started recruiting patients. And the reason for doing this is to try to discourage the selective reporting of trials and to try to encourage the reporting of trials as they were in the form that they were originally designed to report, so that people don't change the endpoints partway through. So there are various trial registration platforms. This is the WHO International Clinical Trials Registry platform. It lists clinical trial registration websites on a worldwide basis. The one that most people tend to use is something called clinicaltrials.gov, obviously hosted in the United States. And as I say, we won't publish any trial these days unless it's been registered on a trial website. Another change in process is publication guidelines. So guidelines which help authors to fully and accurately report their research, depending on the design of the research study that's been done. And the prototype of this is something called the Consort guidelines. These are guidelines which, for the reporting of randomized trials, these guidelines aren't trying to tell authors how to do a trial. They're trying to encourage the reporting of a minimum standard of information when that trial comes to the point of publication. And there are regular updates of the Consort guidelines, the most recent which is 2010. This is the so-called Consort Checklist. So when I receive a randomized trial, in the best of all possible worlds, then the authors have printed out this page, and in this column here, they've told me on which page of their manuscript they have either reported the information which is required here, or they've given an explanation of why it doesn't need to be reported. And there's even a set of guidelines for the minimum amount of information for a randomized trial that needs to be reported in an abstract. And these guidelines and others relating to other different trial designs can be found on something called the Equator Network. And here you can see a list of various different study types. I can't remember what they all are. So Consort is randomized trials. Strobe is epidemiology studies, I think. Prisma is most definitely meta-analyses. STARD is diagnostic studies. And the rest I'm afraid you're going to have to guess because I can't remember what they are. Just another example, this is the one that Lancet Infectious Diseases published. This is about guidelines for outbreak reports and intervention studies of nosocomial infections. And a very recent one, which is guidelines for the reporting of molecular epidemiology in infectious diseases. But there are a whole raft of these things, and certainly I, as an editor, when I receive a paper, I very much hope that the authors have gone and looked at the relevant guidelines and that they have, if you like, ticked all the boxes when they submit the paper to us. Another process innovation is uniform guidelines for submission to academic journals. So there's a body in medical publishing called the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, who used to be called the Vancouver Group, and they have a uniform set of guidelines. There are only about 20 or so journals which are actually formally part of the Vancouver Group, but there are several thousand journals which have adopted these ICMJ recommendations. And they're recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing and publication of scholarly works in medical journals. They apply all sorts of recommendations relating to aspects, to ethics, aspects of editing and writing. They certainly improve the chances of acceptance if you read them and conform to them. They are updated regularly. I think importantly what the ICMJ guidelines do is that they cut out some redundancy, so that if you have written your paper up according to these guidelines for Journal A and you are rejected by Journal A, and then you then submit it to Journal B, which conforms to the same set of guidelines, you don't have to do a complete rewrite. Or you shouldn't have to. Then, of course, we have such things as submission software. This is a whole new thing in the last 15 years or so. Continually develops, continually gets better, although I'm told that the new system which Elsevier is introducing soon is considerably worse than the old, but I haven't experienced it yet, so we'll I'm yet to find out. It is a time-consuming process to submit using any of these software programs, but it does save a lot of time down the line. I mean, there are dozens of examples of these things I could give, but something that we use is plagiarism checking software. So we can automatically run a report which gives a percentage overlap between a paper that's been submitted to us and all previous publications stored in the database of this this website called Authenticate, yeah, it regularly comes up with hits, and we have to ask authors to explain themselves, and sometimes it leads to outright rejection. A project that the Lancet journals and others are involved in is something called the Reward Campaign, the aim of which is to reduce waste or inefficiency in biomedical research. And so what do I mean by waste? Well, examples are listed along here, but they include things such as research questions based on a poor initial review of the literature. Fundamentally, it's asking the wrong question, wasting your time by doing research that doesn't need to be done, and then at sort of my end of the business is either failing to report it or reporting it in a biased way. And so the Reward Campaign is about trying to minimize all those things so that research output, and it's a huge industry, it's a vast industry, so that research output is used more efficiently for the betterment of all of us. Okay, so that's all I have to say. So in summary, I've shown that there are roughly 20,000 science, technology, and medicine journals being published every year, and that is continuously growing. Scientific output is doubling every 9 years. Internet has revolutionized dissemination of science knowledge and given birth to open access publishing. New metrics are emerging to measure the impact of journals, papers, and individuals, and to take account of the effect of social media, and that the codification of reporting and submission guidelines is going on to aid the clarity and consistency of reporting. And if you want to know any more on this topic, then I recommend you go to this website here, which can give you a lot more information. So thank you for your attention, and happy to take questions.
Please, only 2 questions in case you have.
Hi, excellent talk. I want to know what is your personal take on Sci-Hub.
On what, sorry?
And Sci-Hub, this website that pirate papers, basically.
If it was just researchers submitting their papers to a central depository and allowing other researchers to take them from that central depository, then that wouldn't be that much different from the old system of requesting a reprint from a colleague. But it's not. What it's doing is it's pirating usernames and passwords for library access to databases such as Science Direct, and it's downloading papers in bulk from those databases. So to me, it's no different from Napster. It's outright illegal. It's not the way forward. It's not the way forward to open access. Absolutely not the way forward.
Okay, I have 2 questions. So the first one is in order for Lancet to prevent retraction, what do they actually do, and how rigorous is actually the peer review process?
How rigorous is the peer review process? Okay. All our research articles are peer reviewed by a minimum of 3 qualitative clinical reviewers and by a statistician. So every research article goes to a statistician. And there are sometimes multiple rounds of peer review. So, and I think the most I've ever seen, I've seen reports from a dozen different peer reviewers before we've made up our mind.
And the second question I have is a little bit related to the previous question of my colleague here. So, in some way, would you advocate open journals as a way to fight piracy? And what is your opinion regarding that all knowledge should actually be free?
All knowledge should be, well, but it's not, is it? It just isn't. Somebody has paid to generate it, and as I showed, publishers do the bit that you as an author are paying for, either through paying for access or paying to publishing, is that sliver at the top that publishers do. Okay, so we turn your manuscript into a PDF file. If you want to put it at its most basic, we turn your manuscript into a PDF file, something that you would look at and be proud of and be worth publishing, and you know has the stamp of quality on it. And if you want to do that, then somebody has to pay for it, and whether you pay up front or whether you pay as a reader, somebody still has to pay for it. So I absolutely right. I think all information in utopia should be free, but it's not. And I would add that the publication cost, globally, the publication cost of scientific research is about 2% of the total cost of scientific research. It's a tiny fraction, and I guess I get a little bit surprised about how worked up people get about it, considering what a small fraction of their budget it is.
Thank you for your talk, and I have a question regarding the pervasive problem of predatory journals and predatory publishers. And in specific, I would like to know if is there any governing body that has taken any action in listing these predatory journals? I contact the BL list, which is the University of Colorado in Denver, but it's not been endorsed by anybody.
No, there isn't. No.
The reason?
There isn't. There's no police force in academic publishing.
But there is a standards for impact factor.
Well, if you want to publish in a reputable journal, then the first thing I would do when considering where to publish is look and see whether it's indexed in Medline or in Embase, and I would look and see whether it has a published impact factor. And if it doesn't have either of those things, then just don't go there.
Question over. Thank you.
You mentioned the efforts you do in waste reduction.
Sorry?
Waste reduction. Reduction of scientific waste.
Oh, waste, yes, yeah.
What can be done to roll that out more widely? Because I think this is a major...
Yeah.
Publishing noise is a major issue for everyone in the field.
Well, something that we do practically, and it's kind of at the wrong end of the process, is that all the papers which we publish now, all the research articles that we publish, have something called a research in context panel. And in that research in context panel, the authors have to give their rationale based on having done a systematic review of why they asked the research question in the first place. They have to explain what their findings add to the totality of existing knowledge, and in the final part of the panel, they have to tell us where we are now. And it will take a very long time to have an effect, but the long-term effect, hopefully, will be that people don't ask research questions unless they have gone through the process of having done a systematic review in the first place.
That is what you do.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you roll it down?
I'm afraid that's a huge question. By example, education. I've been in science for quite a long time now, and I'm a little bit concerned how it's become an industry for its own ends. Is that sometimes the reason for doing it just gets lost, and it just becomes yeah. All right. Thank you.